Andrew Jackson, People's President who defied everyone. March 15, 1767, the Waxhaws region between North and South Carolina. In a log cabin on the raw American frontier, a child was born who would become the most loved and most hated president in American history. A man who would rise from absolute poverty to the White House, who would fight in duels, lead armies to victory, and defy the Supreme Court itself. This is the story of Andrew Jackson, a story of rage and resilience, of violence and victory, of an orphan who became a general, a frontiersman who became president, and a self-made man who reshaped American democracy forever. His life would be marked by tragedy and triumph, by brutal warfare and passionate romance, by the expansion of voting rights and the horror of the Trail of Tears. He would be called a hero by the common people and a tyrant by his enemies. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of a man who proved that in America, anyone could rise to power, and showed both the promise and the danger of that possibility. This is the story of Andrew Jackson. Early life and tragedy. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, somewhere in the Waxhaws region, a disputed border area between North and South Carolina. To this day, both states claim him as a native son, and Jackson himself was never entirely sure where he was born. His father, also named Andrew Jackson, was a poor Irish immigrant farmer who had arrived in America just 2 years earlier with his wife Elizabeth and their 2 young sons, Hugh and Robert. The family was struggling to establish themselves on the harsh frontier when disaster struck. Just 3 weeks before Andrew was born, his father died suddenly, killed by a logging accident while clearing land. Elizabeth Jackson was left a widow with 2 small boys and pregnant with a 3rd child. Andrew Jackson entered the world fatherless, penniless, and with nothing but his mother's fierce determination to sustain him. Elizabeth moved in with her sister's family, living as a dependent relative in a crowded household. Young Andrew grew up in poverty, working from an early age, with little formal education and no prospects. The frontier was brutal. Disease, violence, and hardship were constant companions. But Andrew was different from other children. He had a fierce temper, an iron will, and an absolute refusal to back down from any challenge. Even as a small child, he was known for his reckless courage and explosive rage. He would rather fight than surrender, rather die than show weakness. Then came the Revolutionary War, and it would destroy what little family Andrew had left. In 1780, when Andrew was just 13 years old, the Revolutionary War reached the Carolina backcountry. British forces and loyalist militias swept through the region, burning homes, killing rebels, and terrorizing patriot families. Andrew and his older brother Robert joined the local militia as messengers and scouts, children fighting in a brutal guerrilla war. In April 1781, Andrew and Robert were captured by British soldiers. A British officer ordered Andrew to clean his boots. Andrew refused. The officer drew his sword and struck Andrew across the face and hand, leaving permanent scars that Jackson would carry for the rest of his life, physical reminders of his hatred for tyranny and authority. Andrew and Robert were imprisoned in a British stockade where smallpox was raging. Both boys contracted the disease. Their mother, Elizabeth, managed to negotiate their release in a prisoner exchange, but Robert died just 2 days later at age 16. Andrew survived the smallpox, but he was weakened and sick. His older brother Hugh had already died during the war. Now Robert was gone too. Weeks later, Elizabeth Jackson volunteered to nurse American prisoners of war held on British ships in Charleston Harbor. The conditions were horrific. Disease was rampant. Elizabeth contracted cholera and died in November 1781. Andrew Jackson was 14 years old. His father was dead. All 3 of his brothers were dead. His mother was dead. He was utterly alone in the world, an orphan with nothing but rage, grief, and an iron determination to survive. "I felt utterly alone," Jackson later wrote. Years afterward, he would say that the memory of his mother and his hatred of the British were the two defining forces of his life. The making of a frontier lawyer after his mother's death, Andrew Jackson inherited a small amount of money from his grandfather in Ireland, about £300. It should have been enough to give him a start in life. Instead, the teenage Jackson gambled it all away in a matter of months. He spent the money on gambling, drinking, and wild living, a pattern of reckless behavior that would mark his entire life. By age 17, Jackson was broke again and needed to make a living. He briefly tried teaching school, but he had neither the patience nor the education for it. He needed something else. In 1784, at age 17, Jackson moved to Salisbury, North Carolina, to study law. He apprenticed himself to a local attorney and began reading law books, teaching himself the legal profession just as he had taught himself everything else. Jackson was not a naturally brilliant student. His spelling was atrocious, his grammar poor, his formal education minimal. But what he lacked in education, he made up for in determination, memory, and an intuitive understanding of human nature. He also gained a reputation as the wildest young man in Salisbury. He drank, gambled, fought, and raced horses. He attended parties where, as one contemporary put it, Andrew Jackson was the most roaring, rollicking, game-cocking, horse-racing, card-playing, mischievous fellow that ever lived. But beneath the wild exterior, Jackson was learning law and making connections. In 1787, at age 20, he was admitted to the North Carolina bar. He was now Andrew Jackson, attorney at law, though he had almost no clients and even less money. In 1788, Jackson was offered a position as public prosecutor in the Western District of North Carolina, a wild, lawless region that would soon become Tennessee. It was a dangerous job in a dangerous place, but it offered opportunity. Jackson accepted and headed west into the frontier wilderness, carrying his few possessions and his newly earned law license. He was 21 years old, and his real life was about to begin. Rachel and romance Andrew Jackson arrived in Nashville in 1788, a rough frontier settlement of a few hundred people surrounded by wilderness and hostile Native American territory. As public prosecutor, Jackson was responsible for bringing order to a lawless land, a job that required not just legal knowledge but physical courage. Jackson quickly gained a reputation as a fearless prosecutor who would personally hunt down criminals and bring them to justice at gunpoint if necessary. He was not a subtle man. He believed in direct action, swift justice, and the rule of law enforced by force if needed. In 1789, while boarding at the home of Rachel Stockley Donaldson and her mother, the widow Donaldson, Jackson met the woman who would become the love of his life and the source of scandal that would haunt him forever. Rachel Donaldson Robards was a dark-haired, dark-eyed beauty, vivacious and charming. There was only one problem: she was married. Rachel had married Lewis Robards in 1785, but the marriage was a disaster. Robards was insanely jealous, abusive, and violent. He accused Rachel of infidelity constantly, though there was no evidence of any wrongdoing. The couple separated, and Rachel returned to her mother's home in Nashville, where she met Andrew Jackson. Jackson and Rachel fell deeply in love. Jackson, who had never shown any serious interest in women before, was completely smitten. Rachel found in Jackson the fierce protector she desperately needed. When Lewis Robards heard that Rachel was living in the same house as Andrew Jackson, he flew into a rage and traveled to Nashville, threatening violence. Jackson confronted Robards and reportedly told him that if he ever spoke ill of Rachel again, he would cut your ears off. Robards returned to Kentucky and reportedly filed for divorce. Rachel and her family believed the divorce had been granted. In 1791, Andrew Jackson and Rachel were married in Natchez, Mississippi. They were happy, they were in love, and they had made a terrible, innocent mistake. 2 years later, in 1793, Jackson discovered the horrifying truth. Louis Robards had never actually finalized the divorce. He had only filed a petition for divorce. Under the law, Rachel's marriage to Robards had still been valid when she married Jackson. Technically, Rachel had been committing adultery. Andrew Jackson had been living with another man's wife. The moment the divorce was finalized in 1793, Andrew and Rachel were married again, this time legally, but the damage was done. For the rest of their lives, Jackson's enemies would call Rachel a bigamist and an adulteress. They would call Jackson a wife stealer and adulterer. Jackson would fight duels over Rachel's honor. He would kill a man to defend her reputation, and the scandal would follow them both to the grave. But Jackson never wavered in his love for Rachel. She was the center of his world, his sanctuary from the violence and chaos of his public life. Without her, he would have been lost. The road to power throughout the 1790s, Andrew Jackson built his fortune and reputation in Tennessee. He practiced law, speculated in land, bought and sold slaves, and involved himself in Tennessee politics. In 1796, when Tennessee was admitted to the Union as the 16th state, Jackson was elected as Tennessee's first representative to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was 29 years old. Jackson served one term in Congress, then was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1797, but Jackson hated Washington. He found the political culture corrupt, the debates pointless, and the politicians cowardly. After just one session, he resigned his Senate seat and returned to Tennessee. In 1798, Jackson was appointed to the Tennessee Superior Court, serving as a judge for 6 years. Stories from this period became legendary. Jackson as the frontier judge who maintained order through sheer force of personality and willingness to use violence when necessary. During these years, Jackson also built the Hermitage, his plantation outside Nashville. He bought land and enslaved people, establishing himself as one of Tennessee's wealthy planters. By 1804, Jackson owned over 100 enslaved people who worked his cotton plantation. Jackson saw no contradiction between his democratic beliefs and his ownership of human beings. Like Jefferson and Madison before him, he proclaimed liberty while practicing slavery, a moral blindness that would stain his legacy forever. Jackson also developed a reputation as one of the most dangerous men in Tennessee. He fought in multiple duels, brawls, and gunfights. In 1806, Jackson fought a duel with Charles Dickinson, a renowned marksman who had insulted Rachel. Dickinson shot first, hitting Jackson in the chest near his heart. Jackson remained standing, raised his pistol, and killed Dickinson with a single shot. Jackson carried Dickinson's bullet in his chest for the rest of his life, just inches from his heart. By 1812, Andrew Jackson was a successful lawyer, planter, judge, and former congressman. He was 45 years old and seemed destined for a comfortable life as a Tennessee aristocrat. Then came war, and Jackson found his true calling. The general, when the War of 1812 began, Tennessee Governor Willie Blount commissioned Andrew Jackson as a major general in the Tennessee militia. Jackson immediately volunteered to lead his troops against the British. Jackson's early military career was marked by frustration. He led 2,000 Tennessee volunteers to Natchez, Mississippi, in 1813, only to be ordered to disband his force and return home. Jackson refused to abandon his men and led them back to Tennessee on foot, earning the nickname Old Hickory for his toughness. Then came the Creek War, which would make Jackson a national hero. In August 1813, Creek warriors allied with the British attacked Fort Mims in Alabama, killing over 250 American settlers in a brutal massacre. The southern frontier exploded in panic. Jackson, though suffering from severe wounds received in a gunfight just weeks earlier, volunteered to lead Tennessee militia against the Creek Nation. For 6 months, Jackson pursued a brutal campaign of total war against the Creeks. On March 27, 1814, Jackson's forces attacked the Creek stronghold at Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River. Jackson had 3,000 men, including Cherokee and Lower Creek allies. The Red Stick Creeks had about 1,000 warriors fortified behind a massive log barricade. Jackson's forces stormed the barricade in a savage battle. Over 800 Creek warriors were killed. Jackson's casualties were minimal. It was a complete and crushing victory. Jackson forced the defeated Creek Nation to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, in which the Creeks surrendered over 23 million acres, more than half their territory, including land belonging to Creeks who had fought alongside Jackson. The Creek War made Jackson famous throughout America. He was commissioned as a major general in the U.S. Army and given command of the defense of the Gulf Coast against British invasion. The Battle of New Orleans in December 1814. A massive British invasion force, over 10,000 veteran soldiers fresh from defeating Napoleon, landed near New Orleans with orders to capture the city and control the Mississippi River. Andrew Jackson rushed to New Orleans with a ragtag army of regulars, militia, pirates, free black soldiers, and Choctaw warriors. He had about 4,500 men total, facing the finest army in the world. Jackson fortified a position along the Rodriguez Canal, building earthworks and positioning artillery. When the British attacked on January 8, 1815, Jackson's forces were ready. The British advanced in tight formation across open ground, directly into American artillery and rifle fire. It was slaughter. Wave after wave of British soldiers fell. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes. Over 2,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, including 3 generals. American casualties, 71. It was the most lopsided victory in American military history. Andrew Jackson became a national hero overnight, the man who had defeated the British Empire and saved New Orleans. Ironically, the battle was fought 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, ending the war. But news traveled slowly, and the Battle of New Orleans transformed Andrew Jackson into a living legend. Old Hickory was now the hero of New Orleans. Songs were written about him. Newspapers celebrated him. He was the most popular man in America, and he had tasted the adulation of the people. He wanted more. The road to the presidency after the War of 1812, Jackson continued his military career, leading campaigns against the Seminoles in Florida in 1818. Jackson invaded Spanish Florida without authorization, captured Spanish forts, and executed 2 British citizens he accused of aiding the Seminoles. It was an international incident. Spain protested. Britain was outraged. President James Monroe's cabinet debated whether to court-martial Jackson. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams defended Jackson's actions, and the public loved Jackson's aggressive defense of American interests. Spain, weakened and unable to control Florida, eventually sold the territory to the United States in 1819. Jackson had seized Florida by force, and America had rewarded him for it. In 1823, Jackson was elected to the U.S. Senate again, representing Tennessee, but his eyes were on a bigger prize, the presidency. In the election of 1824, Andrew Jackson ran for president against John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. Jackson won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, but not a majority. Under the Constitution, the election was thrown to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, who had finished fourth, threw his support to John Quincy Adams. Adams was elected president and immediately appointed Clay as Secretary of State. Jackson was furious. He called it a corrupt bargain and accused Adams and Clay of stealing the election from the people. For the next 4 years, Jackson and his supporters waged a relentless campaign against the Adams administration. Jackson ran again in 1828, and this time nothing would stop him. The election of 1828. The election of 1828 was the ugliest, most personal presidential campaign in American history up to that point. Jackson's opponents attacked Rachel mercilessly, calling her a bigamist, an adulteress, and a whore. Newspapers published vicious articles about the circumstances of her marriage to Jackson. Pro-Adams pamphlets called Jackson a murderer, referring to his dueling and his execution of soldiers during the War of 1812. Jackson's supporters responded by attacking President Adams's morality, his use of public funds, and even his wife's background. They called Adams an elitist aristocrat out of touch with common people. It was vicious, personal, and brutal. Jackson won in a landslide, electoral votes to Adams's 83. He won the popular vote decisively. The common people had spoken and they had chosen Andrew Jackson, but the victory was bittersweet. During the campaign, Rachel Jackson had endured vicious attacks on her character. The stress and humiliation took a terrible toll. In December 1828, just weeks after Jackson's victory, Rachel suffered a heart attack. She died on December 22, 1828, at age 61. She would never see her husband inaugurated as president. Jackson was devastated. At Rachel's funeral, he sobbed openly. "I can and do forgive all my enemies," he said. "But those vile wretches who have slandered her must look to God for mercy." Jackson blamed his political enemies for Rachel's death. The joy of his political victory was destroyed. He would enter the White House a widower, consumed by grief and rage. The people's president on March 4, 1829, Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as the 7th president of the United States. He was 61 years old, dressed in black mourning clothes for Rachel, and determined to transform the presidency. Jackson's inauguration was unlike anything Washington had ever seen. Over 20,000 common people flooded into the Capitol to witness their hero take office. After the ceremony, a mob of supporters followed Jackson to the White House for a public reception. The crowd destroyed furniture, broke china, trampled carpets, and created such chaos that Jackson had to escape through a window. Servants finally lured the mob outside by setting up barrels of punch on the White House lawn. It was democracy in its rawest form, and it terrified the Washington elite. Jackson's presidency would be defined by several major conflicts and policies. The spoils system. Jackson removed hundreds of federal officials and replaced them with his political supporters, declaring that to the victor belong the spoils. His critics called it corruption. Jackson called it democracy. The nullification crisis. When South Carolina declared federal tariffs null and void and threatened secession in 1832, Jackson responded with force. "Our federal union, it must be preserved," Jackson declared. He threatened to lead an army to South Carolina personally and hang the nullifiers as traitors. South Carolina backed down. The Bank War. Jackson waged war against the Second Bank of the United States, which he viewed as a corrupt tool of wealthy elites. He vetoed the bank's recharter and withdrew federal deposits, destroying the bank despite fierce opposition from Congress and the business community. The Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson's presidency is also defined by one of the greatest crimes in American history: the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, pushed through Congress by Jackson, authorized the president to negotiate treaties forcing Native American tribes to relocate west of the Mississippi River. Jackson claimed it was for the tribe's own good, protecting them from white settlers. It was a lie designed to justify theft and ethnic cleansing. Between 1830 and 1840, tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were forcibly removed from their homes in the Southeast and marched to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The Cherokee removal was particularly brutal. In 1830 to 1839 U.S., soldiers forced over 16,000 Cherokee from their homes at gunpoint, herding them into camps and then forcing them to march over 1,000 miles in brutal winter conditions. Over 4,000 Cherokee died during the forced march from disease, exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. They called it the trail where they cried. History calls it the Trail of Tears. Jackson, who had left office by then, never expressed regret. He believed Native Americans were inferior and that their removal was necessary for American progress. When the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that Georgia could not forcibly remove the Cherokee, Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Whether Jackson actually said those exact words is debated, but his actions made his position clear. He would defy the Supreme Court to achieve Indian removal. The Trail of Tears remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, and Andrew Jackson's greatest moral failure. Final years, Andrew Jackson served 2 terms as president and voluntarily retired in 1837, following the tradition established by George Washington. He was 70 years old in failing health and ready to return to the Hermitage. Jackson's chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, won the 1836 election. Jackson left office still popular with the common people, but reviled by his political enemies, who called him King Andrew I and accused him of tyranny. Jackson retired to the Hermitage, his plantation near Nashville. He spent his final years managing the plantation, writing letters to political allies, and maintaining his influence over the Democratic Party. Jackson's health deteriorated steadily. He suffered from chronic headaches, likely caused by the bullet still lodged near his brain from an 1813 gunfight. He had respiratory problems, likely tuberculosis. He had chronic pain from the bullet in his chest from the Dickinson duel. His body was literally falling apart from decades of violence. But Jackson's mind remained sharp, and his will remained iron. He corresponded with political leaders, advised President James K. Polk, and followed national affairs closely. Even in retirement, Jackson remained a force in American politics. On June 8, 1845, Andrew Jackson died at the Hermitage at age 78. He was surrounded by family and friends. His last words were reportedly, "I hope to meet each of you in heaven. Be good children, all of you, and we will all meet in heaven." Jackson was buried at the Hermitage next to Rachel, the woman he had loved for over 50 years. Over 3,000 people attended his funeral. Legacy. Andrew Jackson's legacy is one of the most controversial in American history. To his supporters, Jackson was the ultimate American success story, an orphan who rose from poverty to the presidency through determination and courage. He expanded democracy by fighting for the common man against elite interests. He preserved the Union during the nullification crisis. He defended American honor and interests aggressively. He proved that in America, anyone could rise to the highest office. To his critics, Jackson was a tyrant who defied the Supreme Court, destroyed the national banking system, and committed ethnic cleansing against Native Americans. He used presidential power ruthlessly, replacing professional civil servants with political cronies. He was violent, vindictive, and unforgiving. Both views are true. Jackson was both a democratic hero and an authoritarian leader. He expanded voting rights for white men while destroying Native American nations. He fought for the common people while owning enslaved human beings. He defended the Constitution while defying the Supreme Court. Jackson owned over 150 enslaved people at the Hermitage. He bought and sold human beings throughout his life. He never questioned the morality of slavery and viewed it as an economic necessity. The wealth that allowed him to pursue his political career was built on enslaved labor. The Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears remain Jackson's greatest moral failure, a crime against humanity that killed thousands and destroyed entire civilizations. Yet Jackson fundamentally transformed American democracy. Before Jackson, presidents were chosen by political elites. After Jackson, the presidency belonged to the people. He established the Democratic Party as a mass political organization. He made the president the people's direct representative, not just the head of the executive branch. Jackson's face appears on the $20 bill, though there have been ongoing debates about whether he should be replaced due to his role in the Trail of Tears. He remains one of the most studied, debated, and controversial figures in American history, a man who embodied both America's democratic promise and its darkest impulses. Andrew Jackson proved that in America, a poor orphan could become president. But he also showed that democracy alone doesn't guarantee justice, and that the will of the majority can become the tyranny of the majority. This is the legacy of Andrew Jackson, the people's president who expanded democracy for some while destroying it for others. The orphan who became a general, the general who became president, and the president who reshaped America in his own image, for better and for worse. This is the story of Andrew Jackson. Alternative titles: Andrew Jackson documentary. From Orphan to President, the untold story, the real Andrew Jackson. War hero, slave owner, and American tyrant Andrew Jackson explained. The most controversial president in history. Full biography, optimized description. Discover the shocking true story of Andrew Jackson, the orphan who became America's most controversial president. From the Revolutionary War to the White House, from the Battle of New Orleans to the Trail of Tears. This is the complete biography of Andrew Jackson, 1767–1845. Orphaned at 14, war hero, duelist, Indian fighter, slave owner, and 7th President of the United States. In this documentary, white heavy checkmark Jackson's childhood tragedy, orphaned during Revolutionary War, white heavy checkmark the Rachel Dolson romance and marriage scandal, white heavy checkmark duels, gunfights, and frontier violence, white heavy checkmark the Creek War and Battle of Horseshoe Bend, white heavy checkmark Battle of New Orleans, 1850, defeating the British Empire, white heavy checkmark the corrupt bargain of 1824, white heavy checkmark election of 1828, the dirtiest campaign. In history, white heavy checkmark the spoils system and Jacksonian democracy, white heavy checkmark the nullification crisis, threatening civil war, white heavy checkmark the bank war, destroying the second bank, white heavy checkmark Indian Removal Act, and the Trail of Tears, white heavy checkmark legacy. As the people's president, Andrew Jackson expanded voting rights for white men while committing ethnic cleansing against Native Americans. He fought for democracy while owning 150+ enslaved people. He defied the Supreme Court and reshaped the presidency forever. Book sources: historical records, Jackson's papers, scholarly research, warning, content warning, discussion of slavery, violence, ethnic cleansing. War Bell. Subscribe for more presidential documentaries. Andrew Jackson, American History. U.S. Presidents, Battle of New Orleans, Trail of Tears, Jacksonian Democracy, War of Presidential History. Founding Fathers, optimized TAGS, separated. Andrew Jackson documentary, 7th President, Battle of New Orleans, Trail of Tears, American History, U.S. Presidents, Andrew Jackson Biography, War of 1812, Indian Removal Act. Jacksonian Democracy, Old Hickory, Creek War, Rachel Jackson, Presidential History, American Democracy, Andrew Jackson Slavery, Hermitage Plantation, Spoils System, Nullification Crisis, Bank War. Second Bank, United States, Corrupt Bargain 1824, Election of 1828, Hero of New Orleans, Cherokee Removal, Andrew Jackson Duels, Frontier America, Tennessee History, Orphan to President. Self-made President, People's President, Populist President, Controversial Presidents, American Expansion, Manifest Destiny, Native American History, Ethnic Cleansing, Forced Removal. Supreme Court Defiance, Worcester v. Georgia, John Marshall, King Andrew, Andrew Jackson Legacy, Democratic Hero, American Tyrant, Presidential Power, Executive Authority, Common Man, White Supremacy. Slave Owner President, Plantation Owner, Dueling Culture, Frontier Violence, Military Hero, Major General, Militia Commander, Florida Invasion, Seminole Wars, Political Corruption, Party Politics. Democratic Party Founder, Martin Van Buren, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Presidential Elections, Campaign Scandal, Rachel Dolson Scandal, Bigamy Scandal, Marriage Controversy, Political Attacks. Negative Campaigning, Inauguration 1829, White House Mob, Spoils System Corruption, Patronage Politics, Federal Employees, Political Appointments, South Carolina Secession, Tariff Crisis. States' Rights, Federal Supremacy, Union Preservation, National Bank, Banking Crisis, Economic Policy, Financial Panic, Hard Money, Paper Currency, Gold Standard, Agrarian Democracy. Frontier Democracy, Western Expansion, American Frontier, Log Cabin President, Rags to Riches, American Dream, Social Mobility, Class Conflict, Elite versus Common, Wealth Inequality, Populist Rhetoric. Revolutionary War Orphan, British Hatred, Smallpox Survivor, Charles Dickinson Duel, Bullet Wounds, Chronic Pain, Tuberculosis, Failing Health, Death 1845, Hermitage Burial, Funeral Thousands. Historical Legacy, Moral Complexity, Democratic Expansion, Authoritarian Tendencies, Presidential Precedent, Executive Power Growth, Imperial Presidency, American Contradiction, Democracy versus Tyranny. Freedom versus Oppression, Progress versus Genocide, Hero versus Villain, Complex Legacy, Controversial Figure, Historical Debate, American Paradox, Founding Era, Early Republic, Antebellum America. Pre-Civil War, Sectional Crisis, Slavery Expansion, Cotton Economy, Plantation System, Enslaved Labor, Human Trafficking, Moral Blindness, Historical Crime, Genocide, Ethnic Cleansing Legacy. Native American Tragedy, Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Removal, Creek Nation, Chickasaw Removal, Seminole Resistance, Forced March, Winter Deaths, Disease Epidemic, Starvation, Exposure Deaths. Trail Where They Cried, American Shame, Historical Reckoning, $20 Bill Controversy, Currency Debate, Monument Removal, Legacy Reconsideration, Historical Complexity, Nuanced History. Complete Biography, Full Documentary, Educational Content, History Explained, Presidential Series, American Leaders, Political History, Military History, Social History, Cultural History. Biography Documentary, Historical Documentary, Educational Video.